Messiah!
Only the true Messiah denies his divinity.
What? Well, what sort of chance does that give me? All right, I am the Messiah!
If you ask the average person on the street what they think of Dune, chances are you'll get responses like this. Yeah, I've heard of it, the movies are pretty cool. Oh, I love the books, I've read them all. Dune? You mean that Lawrence of Arabia ripoff? Not interested. Frank Herbert's Dune is perhaps one of the most iconic sci-fi novels ever written, with over 20 million copies sold, and a legacy that persists decades after its original release. Dune's influence has spread so far and wide, there's a good chance you've already felt it somewhere. Warhammer, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, and even Dark Souls all reference Dune in some way. But as influential as Dune is, it isn't as much of a household name compared to some of its peers, and for good reason. Dune has had some really messy adaptations, and the book itself is weird, dense, and tricky to understand at times. But Dune is absolutely worth checking out. There's a reason fans fell in love with Dune decades ago, and it continues to gain new fans with every passing year. But the original Dune is only the beginning. Frank Herbert wrote Dune for a myriad of reasons, but the original Dune only covers a fraction of his ideas. The later books take Dune's concepts and explores them in ways that were never possible in the original story. And as amazing as Dune was, it's only one part of a much grander story. So, this is what you can expect moving forward. The first part will be a brief overview of the Dune series. I'll briefly touch on the adaptations and the Brian Herbert books, but for the most part, the main focus will be on Frank Herbert's books. I'm referring to the original Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapterhouse Dune. And it goes without saying that this is going to be mostly spoiler-free. I'll mention the basic plot points, but I'll do my best to keep most of the stories under wraps. The nice thing about this series is that there's a lot to discuss beyond the stories, and Dune is also a series that kind of spoils itself. Most chapters begin with in-universe historical text that explores future plot points, and prescience, aka visions of the future, are a major part of most books. The series is less focused on the destination and more focused on the journeys, as you'll see soon enough. But once the books are addressed, the second part will be a reading guide. Dune isn't a series like Harry Potter or The Wheel of Time. You aren't locked into reading the entire series from the first book, and there's natural stopping points if you don't want to read further. The series does get progressively weirder, and while the original Dune is iconic, opinions on the later books vary quite a bit. Dune is not a series for everyone, especially when we get to the later books. But for all their faults, the Dune series are fantastic books. If you're mildly interested in things like space epics, rich world building, and subversive storytelling, you owe it to yourself to give the series a chance. Like any well-respected book, Dune has had its fair share of adaptations over the years. The first of these is the 1984 film directed by David Lynch, which attempts to adapt the original Dune. The key phrase being attempts.
It was almost universally panned.
The 1984 film has its fans, and I see it as a guilty pleasure myself, but it's easily the messiest of the Dune adaptations. This version is notorious for having production troubles from start to finish, which includes changing directors, changing screenplays, and a rough 4-hour cut that was edited down to 2 hours. As an adaptation, Dune 1984 does loosely follow the events of the book, but its deviations end up creating a very different message compared to the original book. As Frank Herbert himself said, he always intended for Paul to be a man playing God, as opposed to the man with godly abilities we see in the film. On the other hand, the 2000 miniseries is a much more faithful adaptation of the first book. This adaptation's biggest strength is the fact that it's a TV series, so it has more runtime to work with compared to a film. And this extends to the 2003 follow-up, Children of Dune, which adapts Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. But almost 6 decades after the original Dune was published, Dune will return to the big screen with Denis Villeneuve's Dune, which attempts to adapt the original story in 2 parts. Out of the adaptations so far, this one is easily my favorite, and if I wasn't a fan of Dune before, this adaptation would have pushed me towards the books anyways. But even though the quality of each Dune adaptation ranges from incredible to interesting, the reality is that Dune is not an easy book to adapt, with all sorts of politics, world building, and a heavy reliance on inner monologues. Much of Dune and its sequels are focused on the characters' inner thoughts, and while it's really engaging to read, inner monologues can be very tricky to adapt when it comes to film adaptations.
Where are my feelings? I feel for no one.
And when it comes to world building, Dune is a series where many concepts and ideas blend with each other. If certain explanations or details are omitted in one area, it can cause a ripple effect that bleeds into other areas. For example, in Dune, spice has the power to enhance one's mental abilities. It's established that space travel is possible through guild navigators, who have limited prescient abilities. Navigators use spice to peer into the future and look for the safest travel routes. Then you have mentats, which are humans trained to perform complex mental calculations. And all of this matters when it comes to the main character, Paul Atreides, a teenager who has latent prescient abilities and was trained as a mentat. So when he travels to a planet filled with spice, you might get an idea of how powerful his abilities can become. In theory, you can cut some of these explanations, and for an adaptation, you definitely should, but it's not as easy as it sounds. Depending on what's cut, viewers might miss out on relevant context. And world building like this is why Dune is so tricky to adapt. There's a lot you can omit, but it's a delicate balancing act every step of the way. Due to the very dense nature of the series, the best way to adapt it would probably be a high-budget television series, with something like, say, every book getting an entire season. But something like that simply wasn't possible decades ago, and even now, it would be an absolutely Herculean effort that could easily fall apart in the wrong hands. So when it comes to Dune's adaptations, the most I'll say is they're worth checking out if you're interested. I'll always recommend the Denny V adaptation, but the miniseries gets points for attempting to adapt multiple stories. The adaptations are good for getting a basic idea of the story, and if you're really invested by that point, look no further than the books. It's always worth checking out a story in its original format, and you can experience the series in the way the author intended. Not only are the books more comprehensive, but you can experience the series in its entirety. As of now, the adaptations only go up to the third book in the series, and while Dune itself was tricky to adapt, the later books are another story entirely. Seriously, it would take some massive talent to create something like a God Emperor of Dune adaptation. And on a somewhat related note, since the later books are unadapted, we'll have to get creative with the visuals, like this.
Together we will devour the very god.
But with the adaptations addressed, we can move on to the original sci-fi classic, Dune. To give you a general overview, Dune takes place in the very distant future. At some point in human history, an event called the Butlerian Jihad took place. Sentient thinking machines caused an uprising throughout the universe, and ever since the Butlerian Jihad, thinking machines and supercomputers were outlawed entirely. But 10,000 years have passed since the Butlerian Jihad, and even though humanity's quality of life suffered, they found many ways to adapt. Dune's universe is dependent on a resource called spice, a powerful substance that can prolong a user's life and enhance their mental abilities. But spice is only found on a single planet, Arrakis, a desert planet home to giant worms, and a powerful warrior tribe known as the Fremen, who have been oppressed for years under Imperial rule. And right away, you can get an idea of one of the series' greatest strengths, the world building. Dune is often mentioned as the sci-fi equivalent to Lord of the Rings, and it's really easy to see why. The universe is rife with lore, politics, and cultures, and it's a universe that continues to captivate audiences everywhere. It's almost overwhelming to a fault. If I were to use Lord of the Rings as an example, Tolkien takes his time to slowly guide you into his world. You spend the first few chapters with the hobbits, and gradually, you learn a little bit more about Middle-earth bit by bit. But with Dune, Frank Herbert throws you right into the deep end.
Why?
From the very first chapter, you're bombarded with terminology, factions, and otherworldly powers. The information overload, combined with the author's focus on showing overtelling, are likely some of the reasons why the book can be hard to read through at times. Luckily, most copies have an appendix that fills in some of the gaps, and for almost everything else, there's enough info you can decipher using context clues. Dune's universe feels massive and lived in, and when it comes to how or why something happens, you can find the answer by simply thinking about how the world works. For example, if Dune takes place in the future, why don't they use guns or laser guns? Well, the answer is shields, which protects against fast movement like bullets. Laser weapons exist, but they aren't used often because if a laser hits a shield, the collision creates an atomic explosion. I'm sure you can understand why firing a lasgun willy-nilly can easily backfire. But I can think of a dozen examples just like this. Now, I won't pretend Dune's world building is perfectly copacetic, and there are some areas that could benefit from more detail, like some of the trippy, mind-bending concepts later on. But world building is one of Dune's strongest assets, and it's one of the reasons why its influence is permeated throughout pop culture. But when it comes to Dune's story, it's fairly basic, at least at first. Dune follows Paul Atreides, the son of a well-renowned, well-respected duke. But as his story continues, you'll probably get the feeling that this is a story you've seen before. A plucky, gifted teenager is called to adventure, goes through numerous trials and tribulations, and rises to the occasion. If you're familiar with Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey, or even Dan Harmon's Story Circle, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Frank Herbert purposely drew from the basic Hero's Journey template, and a majority of Dune was inspired by the very stories that created the hero's journey in the first place. Myths, Greek tragedies, and the Arthurian legend are just a few examples of the stories that inspired Dune. You can hear for yourself.
I went to the Arthurian legend, and I was trying to create a mythology that would give people a different view of how we give over our lives to leaders.
Frank Herbert seemed to view Dune as less of a space epic, and more of an epic that just so happens to take place in space. And when you look at Dune's story, you can see exactly what he was talking about. Paul is our hero, the Bene Gesserit are more or less space witches, and the worms aren't that different from dragons or other mythical beasts, just to give you a few examples. But as anyone who's read Dune can tell you, Dune isn't just a retelling of old epics. If I were to describe Dune in a single word or phrase, there's a few that come to mind. Ecology, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, or maybe terrible purpose. But if I could pick only a single word, it would have to be perception. At some point later in the book, it becomes apparent that not everything is what it seems. To give you a better example, let's pivot to the legend of King Arthur. In the legends, Arthur is revered as the greatest king of England. He's fair, wise, and just, and with the mighty Excalibur in hand, he led England to victory against all those who sought to destroy the land. The thing is, hero is a very strong word to throw around. King Arthur is mainly a hero to his people, and while Arthur is beloved by England, there's a good chance other countries feel very differently. Some legends document Arthur's journey to other countries, like his military campaigns through Gaul and Rome. Depending on what country you live in, you might see King Arthur as an invader, a conqueror, a tyrant. And that simple idea is what I find so fascinating about Dune. In essence, Dune is both an homage to epics of our past and a modern reinterpretation of those epics. It begins like any classic adventure, but as the story continues, there are many, many points where you could tell something feels wrong, as if you aren't reading an epic adventure anymore. Your initial perception will change, and by the time you realize what just unfolded, it's already too late. The original Dune was and remains a masterpiece, and even though other books in the series come pretty close, it remains my personal favorite among the Frank Herbert books. And that brings us to the first sequel, Dune Messiah. Messiah takes place almost a decade after the original Dune, and it serves as a direct follow-up to the events of that story. But Dune Messiah is less of a sequel and more like Dune's epilogue. In fact, I firmly believe every copy of Dune needs to have Dune Messiah stapled to it. It's that important to the overall story. And don't take my word for it, even some random Canadian filmmaker agrees with me. When it comes to the original Dune, it's very easy to walk away from it and take home the wrong message. It's generic, it's derivative,
It's just another white savior story.
and so on and so forth. While I don't agree with statements like that, everyone is entitled to their own interpretation. And for people who watch or read the original Dune only, it's fairly understandable. At heart, Dune is a classic epic. There is an inherent darkness to Dune, but it's mostly in the background, looming over you until the very end. Depending on what you focus on when reading Dune, there's a chance you'll be swept up in the adventure alongside Paul. But Dune Messiah is where that inherent darkness is brought to the forefront. If I could summarize this book in one word, it would be consequences. Every action, choice, and decision has a price, and sooner or later, that price needs to be paid. Earlier, I mentioned that Frank Herbert wrote Dune for many reasons, but one of his main motivations can be seen in one of his famous quotes. I wrote the Dune series because I had an idea that charismatic leaders ought to come with a warning label on their forehead. May be dangerous for your health. This notion of dangerous charismatic leaders can be seen in the original Dune and felt throughout the entire series. There's a lot you can accomplish by saying the right words to the right people, and that kind of power is dangerous in the wrong hands. I'm sure you already have an example in mind. Dune takes this notion of dangerous charismatic leaders and applies it to an entire universe. If you ever had any misconceptions about Dune, Dune Messiah is that swift gut punch, and it functions as a harsh wake-up call for the reader and for Paul Atreides himself. The book itself references Genghis Khan and Adolf Hitler, and when it's mentioned by the characters, they treat it like a footnote. You know something's bad when you can look at monsters like that, and your first reaction is, pfft, those are rookie numbers. While I still love the original Dune on its own merits, Dune Messiah is absolutely critical for understanding the complete picture. Personally, I find it hard to even think about or discuss Dune without considering Dune Messiah. They feel like one complete story, with Dune being Acts 1 and 2, and Dune Messiah being Act 3. As far as closing remarks, I will say that Dune Messiah is a different kind of story compared to the original Dune. In the Dune series, Frank Herbert's books tend to follow a pattern. Some books are typically more plot-driven, while others are more focused on introspection and philosophy. Dune Messiah is the first of the slower introspective stories, and that shift in style can catch a lot of first-time readers off guard. And while the main story is quite slow, the most I'll say is that the payoff is incredible. The later chapters have some of the best moments in the entire series, and at its high points, Dune Messiah can easily match and surpass parts of the original Dune. If you find yourself really enjoying the original Dune, I highly encourage you to read Dune Messiah afterwards. It's where you can feel the full weight and intent of Frank Herbert's message so far, and it fully completes the story of the man known as Paul Atreides. but coming after Dune Messiah is the next sequel, Children of Dune. As you might have guessed from the title, Children of Dune is about the next generation of Atreides. If I were to sum up Children of Dune, it would have to be legacy. The events of Dune Messiah left Arrakis in disarray, to put it nicely, and the remaining Atreides handle it in different ways. Some hold fast, while others start to crumble. Unfortunately, that's about the most I can say about Children of Dune.
Spoilers.
This book is more like a bridge that connects the previous stories to the next one, and it sheds light on concepts that were vaguely alluded to in past books. As horrific as the story's been so far, it's only a fraction of what's to come. As far as closing remarks, the most I'll say is that this is about when I started to feel the fatigue. Children of Dune's main plot can feel slow and aimless, but it does pick up eventually. The later chapters of the book are so good, it almost made the entire journey worth it. Almost. But after Children of Dune comes the next entry, God Emperor of Dune. Over 3,000 years have passed since the last story, and as you could guess from such a massive time skip, the universe is in a very different place from where we last saw it. The universe is ruled by the titular God Emperor, and while his empire is peaceful, true freedom doesn't really exist. The Emperor's words are law, and humanity itself is effectively shackled by a monster. As far as the main plot in God Emperor of Dune, well, it doesn't really have one. Obviously I'm exaggerating, God Emperor actually has a few different plot threads. But similar to Dune Messiah, God Emperor is a much slower, more introspective kind of story. Almost too slow. God Emperor is one of the more divisive books in this series, and the main reason is because it's less of a traditional story, and more like a series of philosophical discussions. Philosophy has been a major part of every book so far, like for example, Dune's exploration of religious fanaticism. But God Emperor is where philosophy and themes take center stage. Large portions of God Emperor go like this.
Maneo,
Yes, my lord.
what is a man?
I'm not sure, my lord.
Is he really a miserable pile of secrets? Or is it more? But then, what are secrets? Are secrets not just lies with another name?
I don't know, my lord.
You there, Gola, what do you think? I think you should just kill me again.
And trust me, I'm not even exaggerating that much. But the emphasis on themes of philosophy isn't that out of place. If I were to describe God Emperor of Dune in one word, it would have to be humanity. You see, the book presents the ultimate utilitarian dilemma. Imagine the classic trolley problem. A trolley is barreling ahead at full speed, and it's on track to hit 5 people just up ahead. But on another set of tracks, there's only a single person. If you're the one in control of the situation, you can do nothing and let 5 people die, or you can divert the trolley towards a single person, which saves 5 lives at the cost of 1. As Chidi Anaconda says, there isn't really a right answer, and it really depends on what school of thought you follow. But God Emperor takes the basic trolley problem and explores it on a universal scale. Instead of 1 life versus 5, you now have billions versus trillions. It's something that's hard to even fathom, and that dilemma is at the forefront of God Emperor. And that doesn't even get to the other themes that are explored in this book. Like previous stories, culture, ecology, and religion are explored in detail. But God Emperor also brings up themes that have largely gone unexplored up until now. For example, a recurring theme throughout the book is the dichotomy between man and monster. Once upon a time, the God Emperor was a normal human, and there are moments where you could see the kind of person he might have been, had he walked another path. But while the themes of God Emperor are really interesting, actually reading God Emperor can be another story entirely.
This took me 2 weeks to get through. I mean, it's so convoluted, I just kept reading the same paragraph over and over again.
God Emperor reads like a Dostoevsky novel at times, and by that, I mean it feels like a university lecture. There are moments where it feels like you're not really reading a story, but more like reading a collection of Frank Herbert's ideas. But with all that being said, God Emperor is adored by many for a reason. God Emperor of Dune is actually my second favorite book in the series, just under the original Dune. In the end, I think your enjoyment of this book will come down to your interest in philosophy and your interest in the God Emperor himself. God Emperor of Dune is inherently a character study, like an analysis on the most monstrous tyrant known to mankind. Readers are placed in the unique position of being privy to the God Emperor's thoughts, and that alone might be enough to change your initial perceptions. The God Emperor himself doesn't seek forgiveness or redemption, merely understanding. So if you're someone who's intrigued by the book's themes and titular character, there's a good chance you'll enjoy God Emperor of Dune. But if you really aren't vibing with the philosophy, or find yourself really hating the God Emperor, then I wouldn't be surprised if you end up hating this book. And as far as the overarching story in the series, God Emperor is the culmination of every book so far. If Dune and Dune Messiah were a 3-act play, Children and God Emperor are acts 4 and 5. God Emperor of Dune reveals the true scope of concepts that were explored in past books. And while Dune Messiah is the end of Paul Atreides' story, God Emperor of Dune is the end of the Atreides saga. And what an ending it is. God Emperor of Dune is an amazing place to end your journey, and it makes up a complete, satisfying end for the story so far. And after God Emperor of Dune, we have Frank Herbert's final 2 books, Heretics of Dune and Chapterhouse Dune. I'm grouping these 2 together because for the most part, Heretics and Chapterhouse feel like 2 parts of a single story. These 2 follow a formula that we saw in past books, where one book is the more plot-driven story, and the other is slower and more philosophical. If I were to sum up these books in a single word, it would have to be adaptation. These books take place over 1,000 years after God Emperor of Dune, and instead of focusing on a single lineage, the focus now shifts to the Bene Gesserit, a powerful order that govern the universe from behind the scenes. The Bene Gesserit have always played a pivotal role in the series, but for one reason or another, their role gradually diminished due to the situation on Arrakis spiraling out of control. Heretics and Chapterhouse put them back in the spotlight, and the main conflict revolves around their place in a new, post-God Emperor universe. The Bene Gesserit have to accept the consequences of their own actions, and they're faced with a choice: try again and hope to do better, or adapt. Heretics and Chapterhouse do an excellent job at exploring other aspects of Dune's universe, many of which we've only seen brief glimpses of. And while there's only a few returning characters, the new characters are equal parts entertaining and interesting, especially Miles Tegg, who's easily the biggest Chad in the entire Dune series. And to top it off, Heretics has some of the best action in the entire series. If I didn't know any better, I'd have thought God Emperor and Heretics were written by 2 different people. However, there's 2 major caveats to these books. The first are the main plots, which are really weird. And not in the weird sci-fi kind of way, like the kind of weirdness you wouldn't want to talk about with your Meemaw.
Get to the escape pod. Really, you picked that outfit?
The plot is something you do get used to, but there are times you'll be engrossed in the story, then you come across a strange passage and think, what in the name of Muad'Dib did I just read? But the other caveat is with Chapterhouse Dune. Heretics and Chapterhouse feel like Acts 1 and 2 of a story, but it's a story without an Act 3. Chapterhouse Dune has a very open ending, and while I personally don't mind that, the lack of proper closure can be a deal breaker for some readers.
That's the last one!
In various interviews, Frank has mentioned notes and plans for a potential Dune 7, and Chapterhouse itself seems to have hints as to where the story might have been headed. For example, the main adversaries in the book are implied to be running away from something even more powerful, but Chapterhouse never explores what that was. But sadly, Frank Herbert passed away in 1986, and his original vision for Dune 7 was never truly realized. And yet, the Dune series did continue. In 1999, Frank Herbert's son, Brian Herbert, and sci-fi author Kevin J. Anderson collaborated on a new series set in the Dune universe. They have since written many books within the Dune series, and the series continues to receive new titles to this day. Now, opinions on the Brian Herbert and KJA books vary quite a bit. A majority of the fanbase seems to absolutely despise them, but I have seen fans enjoy them for what they are. As for my own 2 cents, I can't say I'm a fan of what I read. I only read House Atreides, which was the first of a prequel trilogy. I wouldn't say House Atreides was bad, but it was very different from reading the Frank Herbert books. Frank's books always had strong, concrete world building, complex plots and characters, and a myriad of interesting themes and ideas. Frank's books felt as if they always had something to say, and they'd always raise interesting questions that always made you think. But when I read House Atreides, everything about the original Dune series felt simplified. Everything from the plot threads, the characters, and even the prose itself felt like a more simple, watered-down version of Frank's Dune series. And none of this is a negative by any means. If you want proof that a simplified story based on Dune can succeed, then have I got the series for you. Based on what I read, I wouldn't call it a bad experience, and I did like some plot threads and ideas. But by the time I finished House Atreides, I just didn't feel compelled to read any more. It wasn't really for me, but that doesn't mean you won't be able to enjoy them on their own merits. The Brian Herbert and KJA books are very different, and for many, that change might just be the perfect fit. And with the Dune series addressed, now comes the easy part, the reading guides. As you could surmise from each overview, the Dune series does weave together into a grander overarching story, but there are natural stopping points within the series, and it's totally fine to end your journey wherever you see fit. While I love parts of the later books, I'll be the first to admit they aren't for everyone. The later books in the series can be weird, dense, and dry, and depending on your personal preferences, it can make for a very frustrating experience. And while we're on the subject of reading, I'll always recommend the audiobook versions. The audiobooks breathe new life into the dense prose of the series, and if you aren't a heavy book reader, I can't recommend them enough. So as far as the reading guides themselves, these are your options. The first is Dune and Dune Messiah. These 2 cover the rise and fall of Muad'Dib, with Dune as Act 1 and 2, and Dune Messiah as Act 3. In many ways, Dune is a modern reimagining of a Greek tragedy, and these 2 books really drive home Frank Herbert's original intent. Dune Messiah does leave a few lingering plot threads, but this is a complete, satisfying end for Paul Atreides. Second, you have Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, and God Emperor of Dune. These books cover the Atreides legacy from beginning to end, with Dune being Acts 1 and 2, Dune Messiah being Act 3, Children of Dune is Act 4, and God Emperor of Dune is Act 5. With these books, every story beat and plot thread is addressed eventually, and the full scope of the series is revealed at last. God Emperor of Dune leaves no unanswered questions, and the ending wraps up everything in a poignant, beautiful way. Third, you have all of Frank Herbert's books, from Dune all the way to Chapterhouse Dune. While Dune to God Emperor makes up one overarching story, Heretics and Chapterhouse are more like a different story that takes place in the same universe. The later books add some insight to God Emperor of Dune, but for the most part, Heretics and Chapterhouse are distinct stories. Opinions on the last two books vary, but there's a lot of really awesome parts that make them worth checking out. If you love Frank Herbert's writing so far and want more Dune, you'll most likely enjoy Heretics and Chapterhouse. And lastly, we have Everything Under the Sun. At this point, you're basically stuck in the Dune mines until the end of time, for better and for worse. The Brian Herbert and KJA books are very different compared to Frank Herbert's, but they very well could be just the books for you. But no matter which path you take, I hope you have a blast. Many classic books are classics for a reason, and even though many stories have come and gone, Dune remains just as awesome as it was decades ago. And even though the Dune series is decades old, fans come up with new ideas, interpretations, and theories to this day. The Dune series is a fantastic journey to experience, and while I can't guarantee you'll love all of it, it's sure to be something you won't forget.